Okay, American history, welcome, chapter 25. I also noticed in the book that post-World War II, it's called The American Age. And that's because we made out pretty good in World War II. After all, Europe is destroyed. Much of it is destroyed. Much of Japan is destroyed, and China lay in ruins. If you look, a really interesting statistic, you look at the number of deaths in World War II. The top country with the number of deaths, if I remember correctly, is China. And that's often overlooked. Remember, China was on our side. They were fighting against the Japanese. It's something called the Rape of Nanking. Just devastating for the Chinese. So much death within China. So they're really hurt by it. And then the revolution leading to Mao is further going to hamper China's ability to develop. But the second, or the first, I can't remember, they were close, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had about 11 million combat deaths and 12 million civilian deaths. Compare that to the United States. We had about 250, 300,000 combat deaths, and we had about 3,000 civilian deaths. Almost all of those at Pearl Harbor. And that's it. I mean, so we're left, my point is we're left unscathed. Germany, Britain, France, all much more hurt by the Second World War than we were. And so that leaves us in a unique position. And FDR had kind of started it off when he had, before he died, led to the creation of the United Nations. And so the United Nations was a continuation of what Wilson had tried to do, an organization to help create world peace. And it's still around today, so it has done some good, for sure, but of course it is definitely a struggle. And we'll get to that. The purpose of the United Nations was to try to create an organization where if one country became aggressive, the other countries could put a stop to it. They could resolve things peacefully through resolutions, not through war. But the five members of the Security Council, and that's still the way it is today, were the winners of World War II. The United States, Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union. Today it's Russia. When Russia invaded Ukraine, that's why the United Nations, even though most of the world condemned it, was unable to do anything because Russia has a veto power, and plus China would abstain. And so it's made it difficult. We saw immediately, I think the important thing is the end of World War II is the beginning of the Cold War. And the Cold War is this really bipolar clash between the communist Soviet Union and the democratic and capitalist United States. And we also see the beginnings of the end of imperialism across the globe. And so with the beginnings of the end of imperialism across the globe, these newly independent countries, some of them are turning, it's like we're putting them in this position. You're either going to choose the Soviet Union or you're going to choose us, which is, as long as they're not communist, we're okay with them, which leads to our CIA and other things backing people like in places like Chile or in Iran and elsewhere that not exactly are good people and are not people who believe in democracies, but hey, they're not communist, and that's the key fundamental criteria. Europe becomes divided, the Iron Curtain descends across Europe, and our policy becomes one of containment. We want to stop communism from spreading, and that becomes part of what's called the Truman Doctrine, and so then in the Marshall Plan. And so we create a club for democracies. This is really important. That club for democracies is called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We help the Greeks and the Turks under the Marshall Plan avoid communism, so they join the club. Britain and France and other Western democracies join the club. You want to be a part of the club, you have to be a democracy. There's certain requirements that you have to meet: open and fair elections, checks and balances within your governmental system, but this club is going to back each other up. So if anybody that's not in the club were to attack one of these members, then there is a mutual defense agreement where we got each other's backs. And that was created out of fear of the Soviet Union. The Soviets would create their organization too, called the Warsaw Pact. This is really important because after the fall of the Berlin Wall and then the fall of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, NATO expanded into Eastern Europe. Today, NATO includes, of course, countries like Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and these countries, some of them border, like Poland and Slovakia, they border Ukraine. And so if Russia were to attack one of those countries, then that would be an attack against democracy and against the United States. The mutual defense clause would kick in. That all began after World War II. So that is especially important as well. Some other things you're going to learn about. They talk about the civil rights of the 1940s. They even mention of Jackie Robinson, and then there would be strong opposition to that in the South. They were called the Dixiecrats. President Truman did something. I hope I have that book here somewhere handy. I was just thinking of it, and actually I do. President Truman, this guy, The Blinding of Sergeant Isaac Woodard and the Awakening of President Harry Truman. So this guy here, he comes home from World War II, and he's with the white soldiers, and they've been away from home for 2 or 3 years. And Isaac Woodard and the white soldiers are laughing. They're having a good time. They're so happy. They're finally getting to go home after 2 years. And I can remember when I went to basic training, and I was only gone for like 3 months. I was so happy to be going home. They're so happy to be going home. But the bus driver, they're in the South, and he was so upset because the black and white soldiers sitting together, and this black soldier has a uniform, which means prestige, which means power. He cannot stand it. And so he stops the bus. He tells this Isaac Woodard to get off the bus. He calls the sheriff, says he's causing trouble. The next morning, Isaac Woodard woke up, and he was severely beaten, and he was blind. And the sheriff said, well, he resisted arrest. The reason he was blinded is because the billy club was taken and it gouged his eyes out. So think about that. Resisting arrest, gouging eyes out. Harry Truman, who was in World War I, was so upset about this that it motivated him to finally integrate the military, to stop the segregated military. And it took extreme courage for Truman to do that, political courage, because he knew when he did it, the South would be gone. The South had always voted Democrat, and that's when the South begins to flip to Republican. At first, they're like, no, we're not voting for Republican because that's the party of Lincoln. We hate Lincoln. But then we're not going to vote for a Democrat because Truman integrated the military. So they created the States' Rights, or the Dixiecrat Party, to resist the upcoming civil rights movement, which in some ways begins with the blinding of Isaac Woodard. Fascinating story that's often kind of left out in that narrative about the civil rights. But the resistance in the South to integration would be huge. China would become communist, and then you're going to have a war in Korea. It's often called the Forgotten War. But that war, at the end of the war, they divide Korea, North and South, with the plan of reuniting it, but it never becomes reunited. Then the North invades the South, and then we come in to stop them. We overextend ourselves to the North and take over most of the North before the Chinese enter the war, and then it continues in a stalemate for a couple of years before the war finally there's an armistice. So they agree to stop the fighting, and they build the DMZ. That today is why North and South Korea is divided, and why we have like 30,000 troops in South Korea, because of what happened at this time. You'll learn about MacArthur, some really good stuff there. And in fact, I think for this week, I might have a video for you to watch on that, because there's a really good book and a good video on that. We'll see if we have time. Oh my goodness, there's the Red Scare too, but it's 9 minutes, 48 seconds. I didn't even get to go over McCarthyism, so you better read and learn about it on your own, because that's how online classes work. Best of luck. Email me if you have trouble.